Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our first breakout session. We're focusing tonight on rights of nature and using this opportunity to take a closer look. My name is Marky Miller. I'm with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund communication team. My passion for rights of nature began when my community of Toledo, Ohio lost access to safe, clean drinking water due to a toxic algal bloom in Lake Erie. That crisis was the catalyst for my community to enact the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, the first rights of nature law in the US for a specific ecosystem. We have two CELDF organizers with us tonight, Michelle Sanborn and Ben Price. Michelle is our New England community organizer. Recently, Michelle has worked with multiple New Hampshire communities to pass enforceable laws to recognize rights of ecosystems and a human right to a livable climate that's capable of sustaining human societies. Ben Price is our national community organizer. Last year, Ben worked with the Denver Homeless Out Loud on a first in the nation ballot initiative to recognize an enforceable human right to survive for people experiencing homelessness. Corporate real estate interest and the oil and gas industry spent millions in a sophisticated propaganda campaign against that initiative. So thank you, Ben and Michelle, for giving us your time tonight. We're gonna get started with a few questions that were submitted in advance, but feel free to post your questions in the chat. Our moderator and my colleague Simon Davis Cohen will be keeping track of those. So you can post directly in the chat for everyone, or if you prefer, you can send Simon a private message and he'll make sure that we keep track of all of those. There's two things I want to note really quick before we begin here. First of all, we do have microphones muted for everyone tonight. It's not an attempt to stifle the conversation or silence voices. We just want to make sure we're limiting background noise as much as possible so everyone can hear with limited distractions. So we do apologize if it feels one-sided. We hope this is just the beginning of many meaningful conversations down the road, and we certainly remain open to connecting with everyone with either on this call or within your community after this. So we'll do our best to make sure we get as many questions answered tonight, but that invitation stands well beyond this call to connect. Secondly, I just want to bring up that the focus of this call is rights of nature, but we want to acknowledge the vocal and physical expressions of pain and anger that are being voiced by communities across the nation right now from the public and cold-blooded murder of George Floyd, who is just one name in a long list of unjust and senseless violent killings. So CELDF stands in solidarity with protesters, and we're eager to listen, learn, and support those efforts of what's happening right now. Our work is about amplifying and empowering local voices, and we recognize that the voices of Indigenous humans and people of color need to be at the forefront of movements that are activating change. So thank you for your patience while we take care of all that. Hopefully everybody is with us now. Please remember you can post things in the chat, and we'll get started with a question that I hope will help us sort of connect the dots with different issues. We are right now experiencing a global health crisis with the pandemic, and that has shed a lot of light on corporate privilege and corporate rights. And we have city officials labeling racism as a public health crisis. And the recent protests and energy behind the Black Lives Matter movement is giving people the impression that there's change in the air, that people are ready to accept this change. And the question that we got was, what can the rights of nature movement take away from all of this that's going on? And also what can we maybe add to what's unfolding in front of us? So Ben, if you want to get started.
Thank you, and hi to everyone that's joined us. Really happy to have you here with us tonight. Really good turnout that we have. And we were talking before we got on, went live here about the kind of the strangeness of this. We're separated with quarantine. We're separated in time and space and everything else. And I can't see any of you, and I'm sorry for that. but I think we've got over 80 people that have joined us right now, and it would be really a crowded screen. So I'm sorry for that. Love to be in the same room with all of you. The situation we're in now, and I want to just share with Michelle and have her pitch in here too, but we're in a peculiar situation, and I'll speak personally. I think that it's been a real opportunity, strangely enough, under quarantine, to reflect and to consider what's really important, what I personally can live without that I took for granted in the past, lots of conveniences that we think are, well, they're just ours, and we naturally should be able to access those conveniences. Some folks have obviously have a lot less patience about all that and have expressed it in less than friendly ways on the streets and not been met by police brutality, armed to the teeth as many of them were. But we're in a position now where we have the time to reflect and consider some important big questions. And some of those are, when it comes to rights of nature, what is our relationship to nature? Do we really respect nature in the way that, as members of it, as participants in nature, as part of nature, and not apart from it? Are we able to do that if we went back to so-called normal, where everything is, a one-time use plastic, throw it away into the environment, just as an example. Nature and our relationship to it is something that I don't think we find the time to consider, to reflect on very frequently in our busy lives. Maybe we've got an opportunity, and we've had an opportunity since March, to reflect on that. And I ask everyone here, if you haven't done that, to take some time and consider it. What is your role in nature? What's your relationship to the natural world? Not just how do you enjoy it, but how does it enjoy you or not enjoy you? What's your impact on it? There's a lot more I could say about this. We're in a very strange and unique situation that I've been able to take some valuable thoughts from it. And I don't know, Michelle, maybe you could share some of your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. To what Ben said, it is kind of an interesting interface, but also grateful for it at the same time. It allows people to connect, even though it's not as personable as being in the same room. So as you were sharing there, Ben, it makes me think about all the different things that are happening during this time, and the impact not only on human beings, but on ecosystems. And we've heard about the rollbacks from the EPA. I've read articles about the state really doing super preemption, so super control, if you will, over local any kind of local permitting or decision making around different projects. And so looking at how rights of nature comes into play with all of this, it really reveals that those regulations in and of themselves are a very different ball game than rights of nature. So I know that for me, it's allowed the opportunity to have some conversations that people just weren't really willing to have prior to, I guess, the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. And those conversations have been focused more around, that difference between the regulations. What purpose do they serve? Are they actually serving the purpose that people think that they are? Where do they come into play? And then where does, how is rights of nature different from that? And so I think it's opened the door to have some conversations that we haven't been able to have previously.
Thank you. And then Michelle, if we could continue with you, what strategies do you find to be most effective to begin to move the needle toward recognition of rights of nature?
Yes, that's a big question. And I think, conversation is a good start for sure, discussion and conversation, but getting into strategies, it's about taking action. We can have all the conversations in the world, and they're great. They're energizing and inspiring. But if we don't back those conversations and ideas with action, then are we really moving the needle, in any direction? Maybe in our own minds, possibly, but not necessarily in a tangible way that can be applied and actually make structural change. And that structural change in recognizing rights of nature is about empowering ecosystems to have the rights that are necessary for those ecosystems to survive, to exist, to regenerate, and the way in which they do so, which is very different from the way humans do so, and different from the way other sentient beings do so. So it's really recognizing uniqueness for ecosystems and what is it that is necessary to move that needle. And strategies, conversations for sure, starter point, but then, are we looking at, there's a lot of different strategies, civil disobedience, which is really just not, let's say, complying or participating, withdrawing our consent to be governed in a certain way, or withdrawing our consent to view things in a certain way. There's also, a number of communities have been looking at nonviolent direct action, or just direct action, which is really being tangibly involved. Direct action in and of itself does not mean that it is connected to violence. And I think that that's really key. So in strategies, looking at lawmaking, is one strategy. Direct action can be part of that, but that's another strategy. Civil disobedience is another strategy. Education, information, awareness, they're all various strategies. And I think a lot of it depends on where people are at, meeting people where they're at to move them in awareness, which is the beginning point, changing hearts and minds.
Definitely, thank you. Ben, so I'm gonna give you like one of the bigger questions here that I know we could probably take up all night talking about and answering. So don't feel obligated to cover it completely, but enforcement is a really big piece of the puzzle with rights of nature. So can you touch on what enforcement looks like, or even what it could look like or should look like with rights of nature? Who has that ability now? Who should be responsible for enforcing, upholding, and protecting not just rights of nature laws, but values?
Thanks, Marky. Yeah, currently enforcement of environmental laws is left to the government. And as we know, environmental regulations, as Michelle was alluding to, don't actually protect anything. Essentially, what they do is protect the permit holders that have been, that their ability to do a certain amount of legalized harm is licensed with a permit. And it also prohibits communities from protecting themselves and their environments any more strictly than the regulations allow. That's what we call ceiling preemption. It stops you, it forbids you at the local level, at the state or the county level, from protecting the environment any more strictly than state and federal law puts in place. So right now, who enforces it and what's the outcome? Well, the government enforces, and the outcome is the environment is being destroyed instead of all at once, just kind of gradually. That's what we regulate, is how fast we're destroying it. We need to change our value system. The value system right now, it prefers and it privileges the accumulation of wealth, profitability, and so forth, over the rights of people and over the rights of ecosystems. And changing that around means making laws that express values differently, that say that nature actually is not just property, it's not just objects, it's subject. It has its own rights. And we have some obligations, not just privileges to enjoy the natural world. That's why we draft laws, local, municipal, and county laws, and hopefully we'll also see state and federal laws eventually recognizing the rights of ecosystems. In terms of enforcement today, again, Michelle alluded to it when she talked about the possibility of using direct action, nonviolent disobedience to existing law. In other words, the taking it seriously that these values are held highly, and that the laws that are on the books right now are not recognizing or respecting those community and communal values that we need to begin to express. That means that we need to promulgate these ideas. We need to share them with people. We need to talk about them in public places and with our friends and family. We're looking to change the paradigm on which this culture functions, and that's not going to be an immediate change. Enforcement is not going to come quickly and immediately either. It doesn't necessarily mean sending out natural resource police to stop people from doing things that harm nature's rights. That's the model that we have today. Ideally, the values would be internalized, and then we have some long distance to go, and we can't skip the steps in between. So the first steps are very important. We need to begin by talking about it, by taking seriously and not being ashamed or embarrassed to say nature has rights and that we're part of it, not apart from it, no matter what Western culture teaches us. That's where we start. Enforcement hopefully will come when the community around each of us supports the idea of rights in nature and looks very, very deeply down on folks who don't hold that value. It's got to become a community value.
Have you felt that that's a conversation that people have difficulty having, even those who put the laws together, who are part of the movement? I just, speaking from my own experience, it's hard to sort of put yourself in that new role. And I'm wondering if that's quite common with other groups you've worked with.
Absolutely. It's very difficult for people to talk about it that way. And I think it's rooted in what I understand as it's a lot more difficult to shed ideas, old ideas that you've been educated into that just don't happen to be true or don't happen to work well for our communities and for our society. It's much harder to shed those ideas, to decolonize your brain from what you've been inculcated into. It's harder than it is to take on a new idea like rights of nature. That's not the toughest part. Many of the communities that first adopted rights of nature provisions in their local laws, I would characterize as being fairly conservative, not progressive environmentalist folks at all. And they embrace the idea of rights of nature in many cases on a very pragmatic basis, to say that when the law recognizes corporations to be persons and this corporate property to have constitutional protections, and that in our own communities we can't pass law that violates the rights of corporations, of property, when that's what we're left with, that premise, it's very difficult for people to think, how can we get past that? How do we surmount those types of legal arguments? We're not judges, we're not lawyers. And the answer is because the best experts about your local environment, about your community, are not the environmentalists, and they're not the lawyers, and they're not the government agencies. You people, the folks living in your community, your neighbors and you, are the best experts there are on the quality of life and the value of your environment. And let's just take that seriously. Let's embrace that idea and shed the doubt that we have a right to do this.
Thank you. So hop back over to Michelle, and this question really came up a lot when we did our Earth Day conversation, but we didn't have a lot of time to get into it. But how can we collaborate with local social justice and climate justice, Indigenous, Black, and local people of color organizations that have been fighting for generations to effectively collaborate and connect this information to local families and youth currently invisible in dominant identity, but also most severely impacted by environmental racism and violence, now made worse by COVID-19? Which is, again, another big question that we could spend a lot of time talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a really good question. A lot of it, I think, maybe this sounds like an oversimplification, but it's about being present. It's about actually listening and being a part of the conversations, and empowering those that are directly impacted with the kind of decision-making authority that is necessary, to be able to make these kinds of decisions in the places in which we live, work, and play. So a lot of this work is about just that, these incredible conversations and discussions challenging our own thinking. Ben talked about that, kind of the decolonization process within our own minds, recognizing that we have certain thought processes and mindsets that we've all been raised with, that we are comfortable with, that feel normal to us. And when we talk about rights of nature, which is very much not viewed as a Western perspective, right? Then it is uncomfortable. So are we willing to have these conversations that are uncomfortable? Meaning that push us outside of our comfort zone. They're not uncomfortable in the sense that they should be had or that they're inappropriate, but that they push us outside of our comfort zone. And are we willing to be pushed outside of our comfort zone and be present with those things that that are not familiar to us? And then, what are we doing from there? Is it a matter of coming in and saying, well, this is the answer, this is the solution? CellDef doesn't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. None of us created the corporate state structure that we find ourselves in this day, and yet we're all subject to it. And so, it's not about throwing your hands up either and saying, well, we didn't create it, so therefore there's no responsibility or accountability to fix it. We'll just keep having the same old thing if we just keep participating in the same old way. So we obviously need to have conversations. We do need to explore how we can change what we're doing. And that does begin with those conversations and within our own minds, and then putting action behind it. So my experience has been to be present, to keep going back to what is it that you envision, and that you is whomever you're speaking to, whether that's a community group, another organization. It's what is it that you envision. We are so indoctrinated with what you cannot do, what you're not allowed to do, what you're not permitted to do, that we often don't even think, beyond that. And so being present and pushing in that sort of gentle way to say, like, challenge ourselves, think outside our comfort zone. And then how can we then support those groups? And I very much see our role as supportive and assisting. It's really the people that are on the ground in your own community, whatever that may mean. Community can be a neighborhood, it can be a municipality, it can be a region, it can be an ecosystem. And so, having conversations around what is it that is envisioned for those groups, and having those voices be the voices that create what it is that they envision and how they move forward. And it's really about finding common ground, as opposed to focusing on our differences, focusing on those things and values that we hold dear. And we are more likely to enforce what we value, as opposed to, these laws, rules, regulations that are imposed upon us. We don't value them in our community because they don't meet our needs. So, are we inclined to enforce them? No, we generally tend to oppose them. So the enforcement comes from that same structure that implements those values, and those values are not most of the time they are not held by the people that are most impacted.
Thank you. Ben, I know you've done a lot of organizing in Virginia, and this next question comes from somebody located there. And they've asked, have you or other representatives from CELDF worked with Dillons Rule states? If so, how? And can you give just a little definition of Dillons Rule and explain that just briefly?
Sure. The funny thing about working in Virginia is that a lot of the folks in Virginia in local government, when I say local, in Virginia, that's mostly county government. That's where the closest government to a lot of folks who are not living within incorporated towns. Pennsylvania's got boroughs and townships, and you know there are no unincorporated parts of the state, but in Virginia it's all mostly county. And county supervisors, that's what they call them, not commissioners in Virginia, when they are elected, they go to kind of elected official boot camp. They're drilled, it's drilled into their head that they can't do anything that the state doesn't explicitly tell them they're permitted and allowed to do with local lawmaking because of Dillons Rule. John Forrest Dillon was a railroad lawyer before the Civil War, and he became an Iowa Supreme Court judge. And in 1868, he decided a case called the Cedar Rapids case, in which he argued that the local municipality in Iowa that passed a law regulating the railroad that went through the town had no authority to make that law because it's only the state that can regulate corporations that cross county and state lines, and that's none of the municipality's business. And the reason it's none of their business is because municipalities have the same relationship to the state as children have to parents. In other words, they have no legal agency of their own. They're incompetent legally and can't govern themselves. That was John Dillon came up with that theory, and it didn't apply to anywhere else but Iowa until the end of the 1800s, when the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in, and in a footnote in a couple of cases decided that this brilliant idea that local governments can't engage in self-government, that would be very convenient for businesses doing business across county, state, and lines. It would be more convenient for them not to have to answer to local governments. And so it was adopted by fiat through the Supreme Court. It was not legislated law created by representatives of the people. It was court activism is where it came from. So with the folks in Virginia, it's a little frustrating because it's very difficult to persuade people, as I mentioned before, that stuff that they think is absolutely true is just a bunch of hokum. And Dillons Rule is really against the theory of self-government that supposedly the American Revolution was about. Dillons Rule says that it's above your pay grade to govern your own community. Sorry, little people. We, in the laws that we draft for communities, the Community Bills of Rights, we challenge that every time that we work with a community. We challenge the idea that people don't have the legal authority or competence to decide what is important in their own communities, and protecting their land base, their ecosystem, and by the way, their rights, their access to social justice. To say that people don't have the right to make those self-governing laws is to say that democracy is just window dressing. We have elections, but we don't actually have the ability to govern ourselves. So you decide if Dillons Rule is something that you want to obey. I would suggest it's one of those things where civil disobedience is absolutely appropriate.
May I tag on to that?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, so I do a lot of organizing in New England and New Hampshire in particular, and which is known as a deeply entrenched Dillons Rule state. So any action that is taken at the local level outside of what the state permits is viewed as, quote, illegal, right? Or even maybe unconstitutional, depending on how they want to spin it. And you know, it really kind of comes down to, because I saw this in the chat as well, like less talk, more action. Yeah, the action starts with those conversations, and I agree that you can't stop with just the conversations. Those conversations need action behind them. And you know, what does that look like? Well, that really in many ways is up to the communities that are most affected. So sometimes that can look like these local laws that Ben was just talking about, you know, drafting local laws that legalize what the community envisions. And that gets into what we value. And so when those laws are drafted from the perspective of what the community values, then there's a totally different vibe that goes into that law. There's value there, and it's a shared value within the community because the community assisted in drafting it, and you would hope that the community then is involved in adopting it. I know that there's all sorts of different forms of local governments, whether that's municipal or county level. So, you know, a lot of times we don't have access to cast a vote on a particular matter. That's held, you know, by the privileged elected officials that then make those decisions on behalf of the community. But there's a relationship there between those elected officials and the community members, which is much more accessible. Even though I know it's not easily accessible, it's more accessible than state or federal level. So there's that local lawmaking, but there's also the state and federal level around lawmaking, and CILDF has partnered with state CRNs or state community rights networks that are pushing for state constitutional amendments to recognize the right of local self-government, which also includes recognizing rights of nature. So getting that into state constitutions, that's not the end all. You know, it still goes back to this conversation around enforcement, and words are just words on paper, and they don't mean anything unless we are willing to back them up. And if we sit around and wait for the powers that be to do that kind of enforcement, we already know how that plays out. We've had that for generations. So the question then becomes, how can community members take that enforcement into their hands? And that's a decision that community members need to make. You know, that's not something that I can speak on behalf of a particular community. We can certainly share information. We can have provide, you know, contact, if you will, with other organizations that do directly engage in that narrative. So there's networking, there's opportunity to gain more information by collaborating with other organizations. So there's a number of levels, I guess is what I'm getting at. And Dillons Rule does not have to be a hold up to that. You can certainly act outside of what they deem to be, you know, permissible for people.
Thank you. And just to switch gears a little bit, I want to start pulling some questions that we've gotten from the chat, and some of these may be repeating back some of the topics we've touched on already, but that's okay. We want to keep the spirit of a conversation alive. So just to start, and either of you can answer this, but can we go back to focusing on the collaboration with Indigenous peoples, and how do rights of nature organizers fit into coalitions there?
It's a really good question. And for folks from the colonizer culture, you know, like me, my roots in Europe and so forth, it's understandable that Native Americans, that original people in North America, would be distrustful and would be skeptical of anything that we would bring to them to discuss by way of collaboration. And yet those efforts have been made. We have to be mindful and humble uh, in those situations, to recognize that we're the newcomers, in a sense, to the idea of rights of nature. They've already been there. They never left. You know, it's not a place that they have to arrive to. We can learn a lot, and the idea of rights itself is even a little startling. I've worked with folks in, for instance, on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the Lakota people. We've done our schools for members of that reservation, and also for Pueblos in New Mexico. And I've been invited to participate with the Indigenous Environmental Network and their gatherings. And it is humbling to be there and to talk with them, and to see that I and folks like me, like us, many of us have a lot further to go to really understand the relationship we have with nature the way that the original people do. So there's that. There's also the fact that the laws, the rules that Native Americans have had imposed on them were drafted by the folks who took their land, who committed genocide, frankly, on their people. They have constitutions, and they have reservations, and they have, and they're treated like, in many cases, like municipalities. It's been a number of years ago, but when I and some colleagues offered literacy school in South Dakota, Pine Ridge Reservation, and I was drawing an illustration of the relationship between municipalities and the state, that whole Dillons Rule thing. And I got done with the illustration, and a Native woman stood up and said, "Oh, okay, so the municipality is the white man's reservation. But the only difference between the white man's reservation, the municipality, and ours is that we know we're on reservations." And that was an eye-opener. It's a clear way to understand that it's not just our native neighbors who have been colonized, that we're colonized, that we're treated like resource colonies when the frackers come in, and when Nestle or Coca-Cola comes in to take your groundwater to put it in plastic bottles, that we're being treated the way that our ancestors treated the native folks when they arrived here. There's a lot that we need to learn, and there's a new way of talking about and thinking about our situation. And I think the current situation with the quarantine and in the streets, and with the beastly behavior of law enforcement, I think that we have an opportunity to reflect on our history and on the reality of our relationship to power, as opposed to the myth and legend of American history.
Thank you. Going to move on to a question that I'm imagining has a relatively quick answer. And I think, Michelle, you have experience with this from arguments that were made in Nottingham. Does rights of nature involve the elimination of hunting, fishing, and trapping?
No. And potentially yes. So it really kind of depends on what that looks like. These rights of nature laws and even local self-government is really about looking at the large commercial, industrial, corporate exploitation of people as well as ecosystems. So if it's if you're a hunter, it's not about that. I know that in my own community, which is what got me involved in this work in the first place, we were threatened by a corporate interest, and we adopted a right to sustainable energy ordinance. And there were lots of conversations. Does this mean that I can't paint my house yellow? You know, does this mean I can't cut down a tree? Does this mean that, you know, we can't clear land to put up a house? These kinds of things. And understandably, you know, those are concerns that people have when they're looking at, well, I want to put a roof over my head. That's not the same as a corporate, industrial, commercial type of activity that is coming in to profit off of the activity, the destruction and the exploitation. So there's a different ball game, if you will. So generally speaking, no, it does not impact, you know, hunting, fishing, things of that nature, so long as that's not being done in a manner that is commercially exploiting people and nature.
Thank you. Another question from one of our participants here. I'm interested in the hierarchy of rights. Does a right of nature, how does a right of nature fare against a lawsuit brought by a corporate business interest that also asserts their rights? Whose right supersedes? And I think we could probably also answer this with how it is versus how we envision it.
Absolutely. That's the difference. How it is right now is the hierarchy of rights is that property rights supersede human and civil rights and nature's rights. That property and wealth are protected by our laws. That was the original intent under the Constitution. You know, slavery was constitutional, was right in there, and the rights of the slave owner to their property, the slave, superseded the human rights of the slave. There's our model. I mean, it's ingrained in the origins of the government that we have. And so the hierarchy of rights as it stands now, I would argue, is upside down. The question, you know, I wrote about it, you know, in my book, and I wish people would, I'm not trying to plug it here, but, you know, read it if you want a fuller answer. It's, you know, what are unalienable rights as opposed to alienable rights? Is property, is a corporation, if the right of ownership of a corporation, is that unalienable? Like your right to life and liberty, like nature's right to exist and flourish. Is the right to own and accumulate wealth the same level of a right in a hierarchy of rights? And I think that we can define what's an unalienable right. It's one that we're all born with. You don't have to do anything to get it. You're born with them. And we all have them equally. That's another very important element. Well, we're not all born with $1 million in the bank. We're not all born inheriting acreage and real estate. And so that's a different kind of right. I'm not arguing and don't mean to argue that you don't have a right to own your car or your house. Obviously, that's another question. But it's not the same thing. You have the right to the value of your labor and what you create with it. That's where an unalienable right to a certain type of property, personal property, exists. But there's a difference between that and a claimed right to collect dividends and interest and rent and things like that. This is wealth that is not earned through any effort of the person who's gaining the privilege. Is that kind of a right equivalent to your right to live and breathe and the tree's right to live and breathe? And I would argue they're of a different type.
Yeah, and sticking with that theme, Michelle, given that our laws have been created to protect individual wealth, and I'll add even property, can capitalism be fixed by law, or is the concept of like privately held capital just a fundamentally fatal flaw?
I would say the latter. I mean, that's a really quick response, but yeah, I think it's fundamentally flawed. You know, so can we reform the structure that we have when everything within this country and this nation was founded upon that concept of protecting property above protecting life, whether that life is of human or of natural, being. I don't know. Yeah, in my mind, the more I would say that when I first came into this work and began learning about rights of nature and community rights, I would have said, yeah, we can reform it. The more I learn, the more I am coming to that understanding that I don't think that it's reformable. I think that it really means thinking beyond reformist actions and looking at dismantling and thinking about creating a structure that actually serves those that are governed by that structure, and those that are served by that is the 99%, and ecosystems. So yeah, I would say the latter. I think it's fundamentally flawed.
Just one sentence more. Would it have made sense for abolitionists to call for the, let's reform slavery? Would that have been an adequate response to the injustice? I would say no. And ownership of so-called resources of the planet, ownership of portions of the planet, in other words, monopoly control of portions of the planet by a minority of the people, just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And I know you both have touched on this issue of enforcement and different mechanisms. There's a question here that, apart from just direct action, what different mechanisms for enforcing rights of nature have laws had built into them? Or is that something that tends to come sort of after those laws get denied?
Well, just honestly, let's be fair about it. The rights of nature is a fairly new legal concept that hasn't actually been hasn't actually been enacted and tried until the past decade or so. The very first law in 2006 that recognized rights of nature, and so enforcement mechanisms that we draft in the laws that we've worked with communities on empowers the members of the community to stand in as representatives of their ecosystems. Sort of like an adult or a parent might recognize or might represent the interests and rights of a child in a court situation. And so community empowerment, what are they empowered to do? Well, within the laws that we've drafted, we started with the idea that anyone had legal standing to go to court on behalf and in the name of the ecosystem to advocate for its rights. And so it was very much within the legal structure that those ordinances were put in place. As we experienced in the legal system, and Marky really is familiar with this through the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and how the interests of a farming corporation were recognized as more important than the rights of Lake Erie by the U.S. court systems. Well, we have a problem with that, and so the idea of direct action, where communities can directly enforce the rights of nature in the communities where those laws have been passed, is something that more communities have been taking a look at. It's a scary thought, I understand, and it's a broader conversation. But that's certainly one of the options, that when people's rights are being abused, one of the rights that they have is to defend their rights, to defend their lives and their land and environment. They have the right to do that.
And there's a couple of other components to that too, that where some communities have drafted into their local laws assessing fines for violation of that local law. There's also, you know, that when, let's say that there is a legal challenge and the community and or the ecosystem wins, you know, that those, let's say that there's a legal award, you know, that goes back into reparations to the environment to put it back into the pre-damaged condition. Have we seen that play out? No, we have not seen that actually play out. But those are the ways in which communities, you know, have been thinking and applying this idea of enforcement, you know, different mechanisms by which they are looking at that and having those conversations and then putting it into the language of their local law, in addition to what Ben was saying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know this March, we had the huge success story out of Grant Township with their local law being upheld, and their Department of Environmental Protection revoking a permit for an injection well and citing that local law. And that's been, I don't know, a 7-year battle for that community. And it's their persistence is really, you can see it's starting to chip away at some of those barriers. So
that's the trick. I'm sorry,
great.
we're probably short on time, but that is the trick, is persistence. This isn't short-term stuff. This is a movement like the abolitionist movement. We need to free nature from slavery.
Yes, and we, you know, I think as we talked about at the beginning, it's multiple strategies. So I think everybody that's been involved in this is well aware that there's not going to be a lot of justice in the courts that's readily available, and it's taking lots of strategies and different communities made up of all different groups of people to try different things and see where we're able to advance. So we are getting to the end of our hour, and we are overwhelmed with questions. There's so many here. We're keeping track of them. I think definitely we're going to discuss different ways that we can keep getting answers out to people, keep this conversation going. I just wanted to give a minute for each for Ben and Michelle just to make some closing remarks here. And I will put my information to connect with me after this in there. And we'll also be sending out a follow-up with a recording of this and hopefully keep this going. So Ben or Michelle, if one of you want to start, just to make some closing remarks, that would be great.
Sure. I think that this is a great opportunity. I think, you know, being willing to really breach these topics that are really not mainstream, right? We don't see them as mainstream yet, but that's changing. And there's more openness, especially under the current circumstances that we find ourselves in with what's going on in the world with COVID, but also, you know, standing with Black Lives Matter and police accountability. And I know that there's a lot of different ways to describe what's going on. And recognizing that, you know, it's a broad discussion and there's a lot of different kinds of actions and strategies that can take place, and that we are open to learning from others, that this isn't just about CELDEF as an organization, myself as an organizer, saying that we have the answers. This is a collaborative effort, open dialogue. We have as much to learn from others as maybe we have available to, you know, to impart or to share with others. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, and I'm open to people contacting me if they would like, and I'll leave that to Marky to share that information in closing.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everybody. Thanks, Marky, for facilitating tonight. Really appreciate everyone being here. And there's a whole lot of questions that I really wish we had time to get to that I see in the chat, and I respect everyone's interest and curiosity on it. Really appreciate it. We're in really interesting and crazy times, and I hope that everyone is taking advantage of the opportunity to step away from life as it was and to consider life how it can be. I invite you, every one of you, to get in touch. Our job is to assist, to help you figure out how to implement these things. It's not just a conversation. That's where it begins, as Michelle said earlier, but it's The action that needs to come after it is putting into reality the values that we cherish. And when they've been smothered and crushed by a system of law and government and by a culture that values things that are not in our hearts, we have the option to suffer under that system or to challenge it. And challenging it can be scary, but it can also be exhilarating. And you can certainly find a lot of friends and comrades and a sense of solidarity with it. So I would say it's time to do that. That it's not okay for us to let things continue as they have been. We have an imposed pause on our lives, and let's take advantage of it.